I am really very excited to be here today with Bridget McKenzie and our colleagues to talk about what I think is a very exciting day for Victoria. I think this has been way too long delayed, and I think Victorians today will be celebrating the fact that we have a serious deal on the table. This is the missing piece of infrastructure for Victoria, and it is never going to happen under a Jacinta Allen-Anthony Albanese relationship. Jacinta Allen is obsessed with the suburban rail loop. It's a $200 billion policy, which is pie in the sky. It's not going to happen. And Anthony Albanese is joined at the hip with Jacinta Allen on that project. We have committed, as Bridget points out, an extra $1.5 billion, which takes our contribution to 50% of the $13 billion required for this project. And to the credit of Brad Dutton, the state opposition here has increased their contribution to $6.5 billion as well, and that will make this project a reality. I hope that we can get people out of their cars and home quicker in the afternoons. I hope in the mornings people can stay at home for an extra half an hour instead of having to get into their cars and go into congestion straight away. This will take traffic off the road. It will bring Melbourne up to the same status as many of the great airports across the world, including here in Australia, that already have a rail link project. And we know that they work effectively. There's an upgrade to Sunshine Station here as part of this, which I think is important. The other point that I'd make is that we are committed to making sure that there are extra projects here, infrastructure, road and rail projects in Victoria that can be funded as well. And that's exactly what a coalition government would be committed to. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
You've got $1.5 billion for the airport rail. The $2 billion you'll take out of the suburban rail, that will be redirected. So this looks like a net spend from the coalition. Where will the savings come from to fund this commitment?
Well, we take money out of the suburban rail loop because we're not, I think like most Victorians, not believing a word that comes out of Jacinta Allen's mouth. So we take that money will be redirected.
So where's the savings for the total spend?
And there will be, well, there's already $5 billion on the table. There's an extra $1.5 billion that we're providing. And there's money that comes out of sort of the gold-plated option that was on the table for Sunshine as part of the SRL. We don't proceed with that, but as Bridget pointed out, we upgrade Sunshine, but not to that extent. And the money otherwise that becomes surplus will be spent in Victoria on road projects. And I think that's incredibly important to hear because I think the Prime Minister and the Premier of Victoria are just locked into SRL. And this project here, this what I think is a visionary project for Victoria, will never happen whilst Jacinta Allen is the Premier of the state and whilst Anthony Albanese is the Prime Minister of this country. So I hope that the Labor government here in Victoria changes its position, and we would be very happy to work with them, but that doesn't seem to be the case just yet.
Mr Dutton, what would you say to Australians, including perhaps people in Melbourne, who think you should live in Canberra rather than Sydney as Prime Minister, and people who say the views shouldn't come into consideration?
Well, I think the Victorians I've spoken to have just had a gutful of the Allen government. The extra taxes that Labor applies, the money that they spend, they always rake up debt, and it's exactly what's happening at a federal level. As Victorians say, they're worried that Anthony Albanese is doing to the national economy what Jacinta Allen has done to the state economy here. And Australians can't afford that. No Australian can. So I want to make sure that we're focused on how we can help Victorians. This project today is a revolutionary investment for this state. It's the missing piece of infrastructure that Victorians need. And it's not just about going to the airport. It's about making sure that you can get home more quickly in the afternoon from work. And this has been a project that's been spoken about for a long period of time. We will deliver it in government, and we're not going to continue with the suburban rail loop because it's a $200 billion pipe dream, and Jacinta Allen and Anthony Albanese and the CFMEU are the only ones that are in favour of it.
On that point, just to be clear on that point, Mr Dutton, you are declaring the suburban rail link dead. If you're in government. That's what you're doing, right?
We are saying that our priority for Victoria is this project, and we are saying that for us, we're not supporting the suburban rail loop.
It won't happen under a Dutton government.
It won't happen because it's a $200 billion pipe dream that's going to stop the Melbourne rail link from happening. And every dollar of Commonwealth funding that Anthony Albanese provides to Jacinta Allen will be sucked into the suburban rail loop, which means you're going to miss out on other road projects, other infrastructure.
Welcome to our ABC TV viewers. We're listening to Opposition Leader Peter Dutton in Melbourne.
I want this project to be a reality, and I think most Victorians see this as the missing piece in the infrastructure requirements here in Victoria, and I'm really pleased to be leading a team that's done the work on it, and with our colleagues here today.
Mr Dutton, just on the Chinese ship off Australia's southern coast, are you concerned about the route it's taken, and what would a Dutton government do to actually deter such activity? And specifically, are you concerned such activity is about collecting intelligence on the undersea cables leading from different parts of Australia to another, and why would China want to be looking at our undersea cables in that way?
Well, the first charge of any Prime Minister is to protect and defend our country, and Anthony Albanese is at sixes and sevens on what to do. One part of the government is saying that the Australian Border Force is monitoring what's happening. The other part of the government is saying that it's the Australian Defence Force that's monitoring what's happening. The Prime Minister himself doesn't know what's happening. That's the problem. And for a Jetstar or a Virgin pilot to have to notify the government of what was happening off our shores is a disgrace, and it shows the gap that there is in intelligence collection and in the exercise of our military forces at the moment. It is unbelievable that the Prime Minister can't explain to the Australian people what is happening here. Of course there's a collection of intelligence, and of course there is a mapping of undersea cable. Australia is an island nation, and we require the connectivity to the rest of the world. Our internet, the way in which we communicate with our partners, with our allies and with the rest of the world is contingent on those cables. And yet the Prime Minister of our country can't stand up and be honest with the Australian public. And I think this is a test that the Prime Minister has failed, and I think the Prime Minister needs to be frank. The other thing which I think is completely offensive to the men and women of the Royal Australian Navy is to draw some equivalence between the men and women of the Royal Australian Navy and their exercises that they conduct in our country's name and that of the Chinese Communist Party and what those vessels are doing. Now, the Prime Minister needs to explain that statement. He's made it now on multiple occasions. He does it in a way to try and dismiss what is happening, but this is a very serious concern for every Australian, and we need to make sure that we have the defences, and we need to be a strong country, and we need to have leadership to stand up for our interests, because if we don't, as history has demonstrated, weakness does not prevail in difficult circumstances. And when the Prime Minister says to the Australian people that we live in the most precarious period since 1945, he's right. It's based on intelligence, and it's being played out not far from our shores right now. And yet the Prime Minister himself has no idea what he's doing. Yes. No idea what he's doing.
When would a government that you lead seek to bring the budget back to structural balance? And the last opposition leader in the Liberal Party that became Prime Minister made a critical pledge before the campaign. Tony Abbott said no cuts to health, no cuts to education, no cuts to the ABC or SBS. Would you make a similar pledge?
Well, we've said before that we're going to provide support and funding to the essential services. We've guaranteed funding because in relation to health, for example, in relation to education, the two examples that you cite, because I want to make sure that we're spending money on frontline services, not on back office operations. And we've been very clear about that. So I was Assistant Treasurer in the Howard years, and I've worked on a number of budgets since then. A Liberal government, a coalition government, will always manage the economy more effectively than Labor. Look no further than what's happening in Victoria. Look no further than what happened in Queensland. They rack up debt. There's $1.2 trillion of debt that the government announces in this budget, and it is going to take a generation to pay it off, because it's about $125,000 per household. So the next generation is going to have to pay that bill, and Labor will continue to rack up debt. They've spent an extra $425 billion. That's what has been inflationary in our country. It's part of the reason why groceries are up by 30%. It's part of the reason why gas is up by 34%, why electricity is up by 32%, why insurance premiums are up. This government has made an economic disaster of the last 3 years, and families, Australian families, are paying the price. And so we will always manage the economy more effectively.
When your response just there, obviously you said you'll invest in those areas. Will that be at a similar level to they currently invested?
As you see the numbers in the budget papers now in relation to health and education, those two areas, that is our commitment, and we've said that we'll legislate. Sorry, mate. Sure.
Last night, a woman asked
asked you about getting the woke agenda out of schools, and you spoke about potentially conditioning funding from schools to change their curriculum or to influence their curriculum. I think influence was the word that you used. Could I ask specifically what lessons or units you're concerned about having a woke agenda? And in the same answer, you spoke about the Department of Education employing a lot of people but not running any schools. Would the Education Department be one of those areas where you would look to make cuts as part of your pledge to cut 41,000 public servants?
Well, we've said that we want to take waste out of the federal budget and put it back into frontline services. That's the first point. The second point is that I want to make sure that our kids, whether they're at primary school or secondary school or indeed young Australians who are at universities, are receiving the education that their parents would expect them to receive. And our position will reflect community standards in relation to what is being taught at our schools and our universities. And you've seen some recent examples in relation to law school and the requirements being made. I think it was Macquarie University at the time. You've seen other academics who are out as part of protests on the streets and teachers similarly. That's being translated into the classroom. That's not something I support. I support young Australians being able to think freely, being able to assess what's before them and not being told and indoctrinated with something that is the agenda of others. And that's the approach that we would take.
Yes. A question from our readers, Mr Dutton. This is from Percy in Brisbane. Will there be any changes to superannuation under a coalition government? For example, would you do as some backbenchers have suggested and drop the super guarantee?
No, there are no changes to superannuation. And again, as Assistant Treasurer, I pushed really hard for adequacy in superannuation for people's retirement. I believe very strongly in superannuation, and I do believe also that you can do a lot of good with the current superannuation policy. First thing, you can stop Labor's big tax on unrealised capital gains in superannuation. So I'm not sure whether millions of Australians have heard this, but the government is proposing a tax on unrealised capital gains. So for farmers, if you've got a farm, or if you're a mechanic with a shed, or if you're somebody who's got a family with maybe a delicatessen and a couple of shops either side, and that's in your superannuation fund, you don't have to sell that to pay tax under Labor. Labor is going to charge you a tax, levy a tax against your super fund, just because the value of that property goes up. Now, we're not going to do that, and we've promised to repeal that, and I think that's a very important difference between the two things. The final point that I'd make in relation to superannuation is that we're going to allow young Australians to access up to $50,000 of their super, because if we'd allowed young people into superannuation a few years ago to take $50,000 to help them buy their first home, they would be in a net position hundreds of thousands of dollars better off today owning a home right now. We require them to put that money back into super when they dispose of their house, but I think that sets them up for their life and provides huge opportunities for them as they continue to have a family and go into retirement, etc.
On your gas plan, you've promised 4 days ago to release modelling that will say that prices will go down under your government. That was 4 days ago. You said very soon. How much longer do we have to wait?
Well, I like that anticipation's building, because there's good news coming, and people will know, and people will know that gas prices will always be cheaper under a coalition government. People know that electricity prices will always be cheaper under a coalition government. We're promising a 25-cent reduction in the fuel tax, so people living in the north and the west of this great city, people in outer metropolitan, in regional areas, know that if you're filling the car up twice a week and you're having to drive into the city 40 minutes, an hour, hour 10, hour 20 in traffic each day, and coming back in the afternoon, you know that you're saving $28 roughly each week if you're filling your car up twice. If there are two of you in the same situation in a household, it's $56. That is a significant savings.
Members of your party have raised a little bit of concern about the start of the campaign so far. We saw some polling, obviously, that rustled some feathers, concerns that there's been, a bit of a downward turn there about, not really getting the message out why Australians should vote for the coalition. The case has been made. Labor's a bad government, but people aren't convinced about the coalition, is what members of your party say. What do you say about that?
Well, I don't think you've seen anything yet. I think wait until we get into this campaign and you see more of what we've got to offer. When you see what the government is offering by way of tax increases and increase in prices, when you see the difference between the two parties by election day, you will see a Prime Ministerial candidate who will be able to protect and defend our country when the Prime Minister is too weak to do so. You'll see a Prime Ministerial candidate who's able to make the decisions required to get our economy back on track and to reduce inflation, to make sure that we can restore the dream of home ownership, where the Prime Minister has taken that dream away from Australians. And I will lead a team into the next election which is experienced and which has the ability not just to clean up Labor's mess, but to implement our positive plan. And that is evidenced today by what is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Victorians to get this rail link built. And it will be built under a coalition government. It won't be built under an Alan Albanese government. And that much is obvious to every Victorian, and we'll have more to say around the country. Andrew,
How many seats do you expect to win in Victoria? And Labor see you personally as a drag on the Liberal vote in Victoria. What do you say to that?
Well, I've seen the Prime Minister's numbers, and I wouldn't be skirting too much if I was a PM about his position. He's not far off where Jacinda Allen is in Victoria at the moment, and people know in relation to this project that if you vote for Anthony Albanese, you're voting against this Melbourne rail link and the airport link, and that much Victorians can see on display every day, because you've got Jacinda Allen, Anthony Albanese and the CFMEU joined at the hip. Well, I'm breaking that up. I'm breaking that cabal up for the benefit of Victorians. I'm going to invest into Victoria. I'm going to put money into infrastructure. We're going to get this great state going again. And at the moment, well, I think we can win a number of seats, and I think we can form government, as I've said, consistently. And we will demonstrate to Victorians and Australians that there is a much better way for our country.
In February, you urged the RBA to act on rates. Are you prepared to call on the RBA to cut rates again, even if it harms you electorally?
Well, as we know, interest rates have gone up 12 times under Mr Albanese, so families are $50,000 worse off under this government. I think that's really important to point out. So when the Prime Minister is promising 70 cents a day tax cut in 15 months' time, he's saying that to families that he's taken $50,000 from over the course of the last 3 years. And that's why I think it's insulting. That's why I think Australians see it as insulting. We're saying to Australians we want to provide support now by way of the 25 cent a litre tax cut for fuel, and that will help families immediately, and other things that we want to do. But in relation to interest rates, I've always pointed out that the Reserve Bank Governor has independence. I've always respected that. I want to see lower interest rates for families, and the best way to get lower interest rates in this the best way to get lower interest rates in this country and to help families is to support your Liberal and Nationals candidates at the next election, because as we know with this government, and as the Reserve Bank Governor has pointed out, homegrown inflation is because of Labor's reckless spending and waste. We don't see this in comparable countries. We're seeing it here because Labor continue to put pressure on inflation, and that's what puts upward pressure on interest rates.
On your lending for policy for first-home buyers,
yes,
what kind of buffer percentage-wise do you think is acceptable? You know, it's 3% now. What do you want it to be?
Well, ultimately, it's a decision for APRA, but our position, as Michael Suk has outlined today, is to make sure that you can get into housing as quickly as possible. That's the first principle. I mean, why are we making this announcement? Because I want young Australians to achieve the dream of home ownership again that they've lost, that's vanished under the Albanese government. We think the prudential arrangements that are in at the moment are too difficult for young home buyers, particularly, again, I've made this point many times, but I'm not going to be a Prime Minister, as Mr Albanese is, that is happy with a housing market where only those kids with a bank of mum and dad can buy a home. That's not my dream for our country. My dream is to help every young Australian into a house to achieve the dream of home ownership, and we do that through a number of measures. Our $5 billion plan to help infrastructure, and that will create 500,000 new homes, to put the 2-year ban in place for foreign buyers, and also to make sure that we have a well-managed migration program, and to make sure that we can help young Australians.
So-called Liberation Day. There's a new report out from the President and his administration today listing several trade issues with Australia, including our strict ban on importing uncooked American beef, pork and poultry.
Prime Minister this morning's ruled out negotiating over the PBS, the News Bargaining Code, and said we won't undermine our biosecurity. Would you like to see any of those on the negotiating tables to secure an exemption from the next round of tariffs?
No, and I agree with the Prime Minister's position, and I'd say that I will stand up for our country's interests every day if I'm given the great honour of being Prime Minister of this country. I am not going to compromise in relation to issues that are of national significance and importance to us. I will always make decisions which keep our country safe, and I will stand up for our interests and negotiate for the best possible outcome for Australia, and I won't compromise on any of that for our country.
If Australia doesn't get an exemption, who will you see as being to blame?
Sorry, just start the question again.
Yeah, if Australia doesn't get a tariff exemption, who will you see as being to blame? Anthony Albanese or Donald Trump?
Well, the President of the United States is going to stand up for America. I'm going to stand up for Australia. And it seems that the Prime Minister isn't able to stand up for our national security. He isn't able to stand up for home buyers. He isn't able to stand up for families. And he isn't able to stand up against people who are trying to do a deal that's not in our country's best interests. I have the strength of leadership and the experience to be able to stand up to the President of the United States or anyone else if they're acting against our country's interests, and I will always take the best interests of our country as the objective as Prime Minister, and I think I've demonstrated that when we negotiated the AUKUS agreement, when we stood up for ourselves in international fora, and that's exactly what I would do as Prime Minister.
First debate, Mr Dutton. Yourself and the Prime Minister have agreed to the first debate of the campaign. It'll be the People's Forum on Sky News and the Daily Telegraph on Tuesday night. What's your strategy going into that night, and are you ready to take questions from undecided voters?
Well, you raised the issue of debates. It's an interesting one because I wrote to the Prime Minister what must have been a month or so ago. We offered 4 debates. We haven't heard back from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is now committing to 1 debate, I think. Is he committing to a second debate? Or a third or a fourth? I don't think so. So I'll be there with bells on next Tuesday night, and it'll be a great debate, and I'm looking forward to it. But the question is whether the Prime Minister is willing to show up to debates beyond that, because I think there is a lot for us to debate. I think there is a lot at stake at this election, and I do think this is a sliding doors moment for our country, and I intend to steer this country in the right direction and to take care of us, to make sure that we're a safe country in an uncertain century, and to make sure that we can get our economy back on track, because I want to help, not hurt, families and small businesses, and that's exactly what a coalition government will do. We will help families, we will help small businesses, we'll help grow our country, and the Prime Minister has no idea what he's doing when it comes to the economy or to national security, and I think that's been displayed again today. Thanks very much. Thank you.
And that